We were joking a bit earlier. I feel like Robin with Batman. Oops, it's not. Looks to be on. So what I'm going to share with you a little bit is I'm trained as a neuroscientist. I teach in the psychology department at Wheaton College, which many of you know is a faith-based liberal arts college in Illinois, probably best known for one of its most famous alumni, Billy Graham. I actually teach in the Billy Graham Center. And what I'm going to share with you a little bit today is dealing with some of these issues of the neurology and the hormones and what underlies addictions. So when we look at pornography, one thing that we sometimes do is we get caught up thinking about sex as nothing but the reproductive organs. And as a neuroscientist, what I know is that the brain is perhaps the most sexual organ in the body, if you want to call it that. And when you start looking at some of the popular press here, you see things like Scientific American Mind has had a couple journals. You see that Luann Brizardine has a couple books, The Female Brain and the Male Brain. And also brain scientists are becoming much more interested in looking at the differences between men and women's brains. But this is, I think, from 2 months ago in the New York Magazine. He's just not that into anyone, sort of echoing the effects that impotence as a consequence of regularly viewing pornography. You see here there's a number of men that they brought in for the article and had them view pornography, and if you notice anything about their faces, which are perhaps very different from the faces that were shown earlier, you're going to notice something about just sort of the slack-jawed, deadening face here, which is the face that is made when a person is absent of sort of positive emotion. So what happens is the face drops down, and it's indicative of poor frontal lobe functioning. So when we start looking at the brain, people immediately get incredibly freaked out because they think, oh my gosh, it's the brain. It's the most complex thing in the world. And how many of you know like all 30 football teams in the NFL? We got Mr. Largent here somewhere. He should probably take care of that, right? But most people can probably tell you what the football teams are. If we give you the city, we can say the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Dallas Cowboys, right? Well, we've got, maybe 15 brain regions that are critical brain regions. And when you understand them, you can actually make an awful lot of sense of some of these things. Now, I won't do a quiz on the brain regions here, but know that it is actually something that most people, if they put a little bit of time and effort into it, can find that it's actually very, very interesting, very helpful. Now, when you look at the brain, one thing that you will find is that there are a handful of things that the brain is looking for in the environment. Faces, right? We notice when we see a face, right? Heck, sometimes we see faces when they're not even there. Right? We see that on the front of VW Bugs. Sometimes I see like two eyes and a face on the grill, right? My kids will talk about faces. And so we also look for skin. When we see people's exposed skin, that draws our attention. So when ladies wear very, very high skirts, it just sort of reflexively we notice it, right? Or when a man is walking around in a Speedo, you reflexively notice it. And sometimes you don't want to notice it, but you did notice it. So the brain is looking for faces. It's looking for skin, and there's something qualitatively different about the sexual act that also the brain seems to be on the lookout for as well. And if you think about it, many of you maybe have purchased an HD television. HD signals are qualitatively different than old signals like black and white signals or even standard signals. They're different. They're different in nature. They're transmitted differently. But in order to have an HD signal come in, you have to have an HD receiver. If you've got an HD signal, but a bad receiver, a standard receiver for your television, you're not going to get the full quality. And then in addition to that, you also need the HD television. The mind and the perception that we have, right, what we see when we look out and see the world, that is our monitor that we're looking at. Pornography is the signal, and the brain is the receiver. And you do find that some receivers are a little better than others. It's not surprising to know that the men tend to be the primary consumers of pornography. That's because neurologically, their receiver is better designed to pick up these signals. Not that women don't, but inherently they are just designed a little bit more to be looking for these kinds of faces and the skin and the sexual act. Women, it's a little bit different, subtly different. But if you think of this HD effect, what's going to happen is it's going to activate different pathways in the brain, and it's going to trigger specific hormonal events that are brain events and also body events as well. Now, it may seem really weird, but there are numerous studies. They're published in urology journals, in psychiatric journals, in journals of neuroimaging, where people have looked at the effects of viewing still images of nudes versus clothed figures, looking at the effects of softcore pornography versus watching an episode of a nature program or something like that. There have been a good number of studies that have actually looked at what goes on in the brain. And rather than sort of bore you with all of these, what I think to be incredibly interesting, regions like, the claustrum, the interstitial nucleus, the anterior hypothalamus, the BA24, the single cuticle. No, I'll save all this for, you can kind of read up on that later if you want. But basically what we do know is that pornography and sexual images inherently activate these brain regions. They activate specific circuits. They trigger hormonal events. And one concern that I think is a legitimate concern is that in many ways, pornography actually rapes the brain. Yeah. It rapes the mind for people. And when you think about early exposure, now with an adult who is willingly seeking it out, consent is part of the process. So it would be inappropriate, perhaps, to call that rape. But for an 8-year-old child who is checking their email and pops open an attachment that their buddy from their math class sent them, hey, check this out, this is funny, and they click it, it forces itself upon his brain. So in essence, it is something that can happen at a very early age. Rape is not just about the physical body, but if we think about it as a neurological event as well, then that is inherently what pornography does to many people, especially those who are not wanting to view it. Now, getting to this issue of HD signals, here's the difference between men and women. When you look at the brain regions that are involved in viewing pornographic film clips. So this is actually a man who is looking at a heterosexual sexual act. And what you're going to find is these red areas are going to be regions of above average activity. So if we kind of look here, if it's blank and gray, that means there's nothing. If it's red, it's high activity. If it's yellow and white, it's incredibly high activity. Well, this is a series of coronal sections. So if you were slicing my brain, looking at me like this, that's what you'd see, as opposed to these images, which would be sort of slicing me from the top to the bottom, what you would be seeing. Now, in men, what you find is this region back here is the visual cortex. Notice that you see when they're viewing something that's sexual, you get an awful lot of activity here. Also here as well, some areas you get even heightened activity. When compared to the brain of a woman, who it's a little more interesting than your average image for a woman, but the man's system is set up so that these same images cause intense activity in these regions. But that's kind of, you kind of knew that, right? Guys like to look at porn. It's not like that's a big shocker to anyone. But what's really important to notice here are these regions here. You're going to find along the middle portion of the brain, there's the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is the part of the brain that's responsible for primary drives, things like eating, drinking, and sex. When a man views pornography, this area basically skyrockets. That what it does is it sort of supercharges his sexual drive by watching it. And if we go a little bit further off to the side here, we also see that there's a region known as the amygdala. The amygdala is the negative emotional center of the brain. So when a person becomes sort of aroused and excited or stressed out or anxious, this region sort of shoots through the roof. And what you find is that it creates a significant amount of a complex combination of, say, stress and anxiety and sexual tension in men, but you also see it here in women as well. The way it's interpreted, however, differs widely. What you're going to find is that men will interpret it as sexual tension, that it's something that they have to get rid of, whereas many women will actually interpret this anxiety as disgust, as fear. They don't like looking at it. And getting to some of the things that were brought up a little bit earlier, in the earlier talks with Dr. Layden, what you are finding is that women over the age of 35, and this is not brain science, this is research from other databases that I've worked on, women over the age of 35 are much less likely to develop habitual, compulsive, impulsive, or addictive pornography viewing habits when compared to women under the age of 35. Because women have to be trained and taught, as Dr. Reisman has educated, how to interpret this anxiety, this stress. And what many younger women have done is they've interpreted it as sexual tension. And so they are becoming increasingly more likely to view pornography and to develop maladaptive or compulsive patterns of viewing and sexually acting out to it as well. So I would say, thinking about this, you've got a lot of other things tied up into it as well. Abuse is certainly a big factor. Attachment to the parents, which we know is kind of in a poor state in our country as well. But what's happening is men are interpreting this elevated state of stress and anxiety, and they're acting out, sometimes sexually, sometimes aggressively and violently. Women are interpreting this, and sometimes it can be interpreted as being disgusted with it. Other times they will interpret it in a more male-like pattern, and they will become more aggressive, or they will act out sexually as well. Now, in a study taken from Merlier in 2006, you see that there's a region here in the brain, the cingulate cortex, which is also involved. This is the region of the brain that is responsible for moral and ethical decision making. Classically, if your brain, anyone who's ever studied the brain, you know that Descartes said that the pineal gland was the seat of the soul. A better way of thinking of the seat of your soul, the place where you have control over what your responses are, is here in this region. And pornography and compulsively acting out to it regularly weakens this region. This region actually has less ability to exert its control. Now, what's one final item here with respect to these is when you look at these areas of activity here and here, what we do know is that if you take a man or a woman and you put them into a brain scanner and you show them these clips, these areas will light up, and they'll light up in a very robust fashion. However, if you take individuals and bring them in and tell them, we're going to show you some video clips, we would like you to try to keep your sexual arousal level low. You will actually see decreased activity here in these regions. When you're given instruction, or when there are expectations about what you should do when you view this, and those are exercised, you can actually dampen down this signal and make it less severe. That's just by them being told. These are heterosexual men and women sort of going into the brain scanner, and all they're being told is, just try to not get so horny. That's kind of what, that's, in a nutshell, in a kind of a crass way. That's being what, kind of keep it under control if you can. Right? And you will see that instead of instruction will actually cause the signal to be dampened down significantly. It's when this signal is allowed to just run free and out of control that you develop these kinds of problems. Now, getting to the issue of the use of the term addiction. Addiction is oftentimes overused. And in teaching pharmacology, what I'd like to do is perhaps give you a different set of terms, a better set of terms, I think, because not everyone who drinks alcohol becomes an alcoholic. Not everyone who does cocaine becomes a coke addict. Right? Not everyone who views pornography becomes a porn addict. But if we use the language of drugs, we've got, drugs have main effects. That is the effects that you are taking them for because they have some value, right? You take antibiotics because it does its job. But antibiotics can also have bad side effects, right? In young children, they can destroy the hair cells in the ear and actually make them partially deaf if they're given over time. That's a side effect. We didn't want that, but it's still an effect nonetheless. The drug doesn't know why it's coming into the body and only does what it does. It just does what it does. So there are main effects and side effects. There are main effects, reasons why people view pornography, to relieve their depression, or to be sexually curious, or to reduce their anxiety, or to be angry and act out as a way of dealing with their spouse. But there are side effects, and we're hearing an awful lot about these side effects, right? Decreased view of the severity of rape, right? Views on the acceptability of child molestation. Those kinds of things are side effects. They're probably not what the people are going in hoping to get out of it, but they are unintended consequences that are stored here in the brain. Now, you can use a drug, and you use a drug because it's the best way to get you the result that you want. Right? You take aspirin because it's the best way to get rid of your headache. But I would be misusing aspirin if I was taking it thinking it was going to give me a ripped set of abdominal muscles. That's not going to do anything, right? It's misuse of the drug. It's not what it's intended for, nor does it give you the result that you want. That's misuse. Then there's abuse. This is when the use of the compound does damage. It's traumatizing tissue, or it's causing something disruptive. That's abuse, right? I can use alcohol when I take communion on Sunday. I can even misuse it to kind of help me. I'm having a lot of trouble getting to sleep tonight, so I'm just going to put back 5 or 6 beers, and that'll put me to sleep, right? Well, that'll help me get to sleep. But if I start regularly drinking 6, 7, 8 drinks a night to help me get to sleep, that's going to start doing trauma to my liver. It's going to start doing some damage to my body. That's abuse. And then there's addiction, which usually entails all of these things. But addiction is marked more by an inability to control the intake. The person keeps taking it in over and over, and they can't stop. And they're trying to stop, but they can't. That it is progressive, that it keeps building and building and building, and that the individual also will crave it when it's gone. And this craving is usually the result of some sort of withdrawal from dependency. And there's physiological dependency, where the body actually does need it to work properly. And there's psychological dependency, where the body, or where the person thinks they need it in order to function properly. And when you don't, and for example, many people say, well, marijuana is not addictive. Well, just because there aren't significant physiological forms of dependency doesn't mean that it's not psychologically dependent. Right? I need the pot to kind of help me get through the day. And if I don't get it, I get stressed out. That stressing out is not the result of your body's kind of massive requiring of cannabinoid receptor activation. It's actually, you just think you need it, so you stress yourself out. There's sensitization and tolerance. Obviously, those are things you've probably heard of before, so we won't go into those. But while a person can use alcohol and misuse it and abuse it, even become addicted to it, or they can, is there an appropriate use for cocaine? Maybe. I'm hard-pressed to think of what other things might be better to kind of get you completely blown out of your mind with a euphoric experience. But that's really not the right way to think about it. That's not the right way to be thinking about it. Really, inherently, some things really are just misused, and they sort of co-opt the underlying brain circuit. So is there an appropriate use of alcohol? Maybe in communion, yeah. Maybe you could argue that's an appropriate use of an alcoholic beverage. To enjoy company. Well, okay, now we're starting to slip over. Do I have to have a drink in order to be social? Now we're kind of slipping into potential misuse here. Am I using it more and more? Well, that's abuse. Is it doing trauma? And am I becoming addicted to it? I might be an abuser, but I might not be addicted. But I might be an abuser and have a dependency issue. So when you start using these terms in subtly different ways, they take on greater value. I'd like to offer that there is not even an appropriate use for pornographic material. That inherently pornographic material is entering at this point and very quickly moves down to abuse. Some people, it just lingers here. Some people regularly view pornography because actually they're just impulsive. Right? Let's look at some porn. And they go over and they look at the porn. Right? And so in many ways they're like ADD kids. Right? They have a thought, it enters their head, and they do it. Oh, boy, that was stupid. I shouldn't have done that. They're not like an addict. Right? Others are compulsive. They get a thought, my hands are dirty, I have to wash my hands. My hands are dirty, I have to wash my hands. My hands are dirty, I have to wash my hands. I'm sitting at work, and I can't wait till I get home. I can't wait till I get home so I can look at the porn and masturbate. I can't wait. And it's sort of a compulsive pattern that they go in, which is very different from, hey, your roommate's not here. Hey, there's his computer. Let's look at some porn. That's an impulsive pattern of behavior. So correctly understanding, not everyone who looks at porn should be called a porn addict, but they might be impulsive, they might be compulsive, they might be struggling with issues of depression or anxiety, but it is always misuse and abuse, but not necessarily addiction, if it's not meeting the criteria for addiction. Interestingly, the APA is putting together the DSM-5, the newest version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which will be used to diagnose these kinds of disorders. And while pornography addiction is not going to be included as a separate behavioral addiction, it will be included as a subset of what's called hypersexualized disorder, where people are sort of excessively sexual in their nature. So porn addiction, the spirit of it, will be in one form, but in the DSM-5, but not under that terminology. And that, I think, comes out in 2012 or 2013. The next couple of years, you'll be seeing that. So, Dr. Reisman mentioned mirror neuron system. There are studies looking at, showing erotic material, and it activates this mirror neuron system. The way the mirror neuron system works, this is a complex, diagram. I won't confuse you too much by it. But the part of your brain that raises your hand is activated when I raise my hand. You may not do it, but when I raise my hand, you're used to, I know what it would be like to actually do that thing. Right? And if I were to raise this hand, then part of the brain will raise this hand would actually do So when I am looking at a person performing a sexual act, even if I've never performed it and I have naive neurons that have never even thought of doing something like that, that image that I am looking at imposes itself, so I now have the neurological equipment to engage in that particular type of behavior. That's what so seeing is, it's not just coming in and bouncing out, right? It's coming in and it's altering the system and predisposing it to now be much more likely, or at least better able to be, engaging in that behavior that I've just looked at. This is why athletes do that. This is why dancers do it. It's why musicians do it, because it works. Right? So we have this mirror neuron system that erotic images activate. We also have, I didn't show this in the other slides, this is the circuit that's involved in every addictive substance: the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, orbitofrontal cortex, anterior cingulate cortex. Every drug of abuse, every addictive compound activates this circuit in usually an unnatural way. It sort of hijacks it and sort of super activates it. And that's why drugs are very easy things to get addicted to. But the reason why this system is here is it's here for natural, regular, low-level reinforcers like food, like water, like sexual relationships. So if people say that pornography is not addictive, then they just don't understand that it is working on the exact same neurological circuit using the same neurotransmitters, the same hormones that every drug of addiction uses. And in many ways, while it might not be as severe as crack, it is more sinister than crack because it's working through the natural system. Crack comes in and it sort of blows everything out, and the cells just say, what the heck happened? And they change themselves genetically. But sexual things come in under that radar so they can be developed and they can linger in a much more long-lasting way because they're not blowing the system up. They've just found it, and now they're going to work it. So pornography is not producing the same sort of elevated, super high that you might get when you take crack and have a euphoric experience. But it's more sinister because it's not blowing the system up. It's taking advantage of the fact that it's not blowing the system up, and it's like a muscle that gets stronger and stronger and stronger. Now, I think in my research what I found is that a critical component in the establishment of maladaptive patterns is whether or not the person acts out. And in a couple of data sets that I'm working with, over 90% of the people who are regularly viewing pornography are also masturbating to it. And in men, what happens is you get this, well, remember, there's that region there, right? There's that connection that's that drug addiction, that natural reinforcer connection. But also, here's that fear center. Remember we said that there's that anxiety center that's kind of going up and up and up? Ejaculation activates all these, but it deactivates the fear, which is why, there's such a release. There's such relief after ejaculation. Because this region is not activated. It's already activated. It's shut down. And so what we have is we have the high, the euphoria that we get off of the orgasm, and the release from the stress and the anxiety. And when a person is regularly sexually acting out, whether it be with masturbation or some other form of sexual activity, consensual or not, this region, especially in men, is going to be activated. It's subtly different in women. In women, this decrease is actually even more severe. It's like women just sort of shut down in their amygdala when they orgasm. So when we look at these brain regions, what we're going to find is there's an awful lot of overlap. Awful lot of overlap. Now, a number of hormones here. You've seen these before, so I won't go into it. Viewing sexually explicit material basically activates all of these. Testosterone. Estrogen and progesterone are subtly different. They're more considered, sort of cycling hormones for reproductive status. That is, whether a woman can be pregnant or not. But they can alter. They can alter these if it's viewed regularly. As Dr. Reisman mentioned in some of her writings, you get this adrenaline release, this epinephrine release. In response to orgasm, you have oxytocin, vasopressin, prolactin. These are all peptide hormones released by the pituitary that sort of bond you to whatever it is that led up to that. I would argue, in my worldview, it's best when a husband is bonded to his wife and his wife is bonded to her husband, as opposed to me being bonded to an image on a screen and my hand. Neurotransmitters. Dopamine, we've seen that before. Dopamine is responsible for this craving, helps us focus in. Those guys who are just sort of zoned in, that's dopamine. Serotonin is what connects us. The drug ecstasy, right? Kind of helps people feel like they're having this transcendent kind of experience. Norepinephrine helps store these things as cortical tattoos. which is why many men say, I remember the first centerfold I ever saw, and I'll never get it out of my head. But what you can do is you can alter that so that it doesn't have power over you. And these endogenous endorphins that are released with sexual response are what create the euphoria and fuel this cycle. Clinical issues, I think sexually acting out, the sexual response is really key, because if you get people to stop acting out, you can start weakening this signal. This sexual response influences context, the side effects, why men view women as commodities, right? Why women might view men as predatory. So the implications are that these sexual images are qualitatively different, and that sexually acting out really is what helps establish these patterns. It activates the addiction pathways, which are going to interrupt choice. It's going to increase the appetite and the craving and narrowing the focus. But I would also argue that as children are growing, their brains don't become fully developed until around the age of 21 to 25. So viewing these things early on, in boys, it's not a problem. That sexual response circuit is like a reflex. It's wired into them. And so the fear with young men is that this is something that easily hijacks it. The fear with young girls is that girls are looking at pornography and trying to understand the context. For men, it's first visual, secondarily contextual with respect to sexual arousal. With women, it's first contextual, and then it's sensory after that. And so women are sort of learning, from pornography what it is to be wanted. This is what men want. So young girls are being taught, this is what guys want, so this is what you should become. And they have that cortical flexibility that the men don't, to become that, and to actually begin to now start deriving some sort of a framework that they're going to know, oh, this is how I have to dress up. So for boys, the issue is sort of putting them off to the side. Don't look at it because it's a critical thing for you, but you girls don't be seduced by this. Don't be kind of contextually taught that this is what men are looking for, because it's not healthy. And I think that finishes me up. So.